in the outer reaches of the rim's middle sector. Her name echoed through space, invoking a kind of reverence typically reserved for deities or the very notion of death. Lyra, daughter of the tempest winds, warrior of the moonlit wastes, the last scion of a shattered royal bloodline. Yet, titles felt unnecessary. Everyone knew her as simply the Storm. She carried fury in her veins and storm clouds in her soul. Her presence alone could crack mountains, and the men who had dared to seek her favor often left broken, both in body and spirit, if they left at all. Her reputation preceded her, and it was not a kind one. Her homeworld, Caldura, was a desolate land where violent electrical storms and blackened deserts stretched across the horizon. Lyra ruled it, not from some ornate throne, but from the heart of the planet's fury. Her power was legendary, and the stories of her strength had reached even the distant stars. Generals from neighboring systems would send their emissaries wrapped in fine silks and sweet words, only to retreat with apologies after a mere encounter with her. She was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too much of a force in her own right. Suitors who sought power in marriage disappeared quickly. Some vanished entirely, without explanation. No decree was issued, only Lyra's cold silence and the inevitable realization that no one stood beside her unless she willed it. Rumors about her spread. Some said she was cursed. Others claimed she was heartless. Few, however, understood the truth. She was weary. Weary of being feared, tired of being controlled, and drained by the lack of honesty or strength in those who crossed her path. Then, as fate would have it, something unexpected fell from the sky. It wasn't a warship or even a diplomatic shuttle, just a lone escape pod, streaking through the atmosphere like a lost meteorite. It crashed into the jagged cliffs beyond the black sand dunes, in the area where the storm's fury was the most intense, and the earth was unstable. Normally, the Calderan patrols would have disregarded the wreckage, letting the sand and wind devour it. But there was something strange about the signal it carried. Human. No Terran had been seen in Caldura's skies for decades. Lyra herself went to investigate, not because of the crash or the human presence, but because that night the wind whispered differently. The storm had shifted its rhythm. Something unfamiliar had entered her world, and deep inside, she felt an old, cold spark of curiosity. Amidst the wreckage, a figure emerged, bloodied and covered in ash. His body stiff with pain, one leg barely holding under the weight of his gear. The pod behind him smoked, its sides caved in from the violent impact. The wind howled, and the sand was already reclaiming the remains of his crash site. Yet he stood tall. His helmet was tucked under one arm, his face turned toward the storm that gathered around him. Sergeant Finn Holt had seen worse. He'd fought in countless battles across distant worlds, surviving even most harrowing campaigns. A shattered pod and an unknown planet didn't faze him. At least, not yet. What did catch his attention, however, was the figure that emerged from the storm, a woman who seemed to have stepped out of myth. She was taller than any woman he'd ever met, her armor glimmering with the residual energy of a storm. Her hair, silver and black, billowed in the wind like a banner. Her eyes weren't glowing with technology, but with something primal, elemental. She didn't speak as she approached, nor did she need to. Most men would have cowered, but Finn only tilted his head. "You the welcoming party?" he asked, wiping blood from his brow. The guards around her stiffened, one even raising his weapon, but with a single gesture from Lyra, everything froze. She studied him, a man who stood unwavering beneath her storm. His expression was calm, curious, not arrogant, but unfazed. Her power surged over him like a thunderclap, yet he held his ground. "You are human," she said. "Last time I checked," Finn replied, straightening up. "Name's Finn Holt. Seems like I've landed in the middle of a hell of a weather report." "You crashed in a restricted area of a sovereign world," Lyra observed, her voice a soft rumble. "Figured that out when the sky tried to electrocute me." There was no mockery in his voice, just dry humor and a steady acceptance of his situation. Lyra stepped closer, the sand crackling beneath her boots. The static in the air grew sharp, buzzing. "You're not afraid of me," she noted, more as a statement than a question. Finn met her gaze directly. "Should I be?" For the first time in a long while, Lyra was taken aback. No one had ever asked her that. Not without fear, not without trembling, not with such calm. Finn wasn't taken to a cell. Instead, he was escorted to the Citadel, a strange move that raised many eyebrows across the court. It was unheard of. Strangers weren't brought into the heart of the Queen's fortress, especially not male ones. Word spread quickly. Some speculated he'd be executed for trespassing. Others whispered of lightning interrogation or worse. But nothing of the sort happened. Lyra herself ordered a place for him at her table. When Finn entered the great hall of the Storm Citadel, he didn't stare at the towering obsidian pillars or the glowing orbs of trapped lightning hanging in the air. He looked straight at her. Lyra observed him from her throne, poised but silent. The court waited for her to speak. Finn gave a small nod. Didn't expect dinner, he said, but I appreciate it. The room remained still. The guards shifted uneasily. Whispers spread like wildfire. No one dared to address the Queen so casually. Lyra raised a hand, and the room fell silent. You're a soldier, she said. I still am. Then you know what it means to kill. Finn didn't flinch. More than I care to, he replied. A heavy silence settled between them. Outside, the storm lashed against the citadel, thunder shaking the walls. Somewhere above, the lights flickered through the crystal dome. I don't dine with cowards, Lyra stated. Good, Finn responded. Neither do I. The room seemed to freeze, the tension thick. The Queen's mouth curved, just slightly, a gesture that might have been a smile or something near it. She gestured to the seat beside her, a place usually reserved for warlords or heirs. Finn didn't hesitate. He sat. The banquet proceeded with quiet curiosity. Exotic dishes were placed before him. Foods that crackled with energy and liquids that hummed against his skin. He ate without complaint, even when one of the dishes bit back. Lyra observed him closely, asking questions about Earth, its culture, its military ways. He answered plainly, never embellishing, never pandering. He was the first man to meet her gaze without flinching, the first to speak to her as a soldier, not a queen. His calm, his honesty, it shook her in ways she couldn't explain. After the meal, as the hall emptied, she stood beside him, beneath the arch of lightning-filled windows. You're different, she said. Maybe, Finn replied, but I think you've been lied to a lot. And you won't. I don't need to. She studied him for a long moment. Her breath was steady, her thoughts unreadable. You're not afraid of my power, she said. I've seen worse things in storms, he replied. I'm not made of kindness, she murmured. I never asked for that. The wind howled outside, and for the first time in her life, Lyra realized she was curious. Not about his origins, not about the crash that brought him here, but about the kind of man who stood before her. A man with no fear, no ambition to conquer, just a man who saw her, not as a weapon, but as a woman. The following morning, Finn awoke in a guest chamber, its walls woven with obsidian and silk. The bed had no corners. The windows opened to nothing but sky. There were no guards at his door, no chains around his wrists. Finn had always prided himself on being unshakable, but there was something about this place, this city of storms, that unsettled him. When he ventured into the lower courtyard one evening, following the sharp scent of smoke and the tang of metal, he stumbled upon Lyra in the midst of her training. Alone, her blade was no longer ceremonial, but practical, as if the storm itself had taken physical form in her hands. With swift precision, she sliced through the dense mist, every movement a ballet of destruction. Each strike was a controlled storm, beautiful and brutal at once. It wasn't a dance of elegance, but one of necessity, every motion coiled with restraint. Her power held back until it was unleashed in a burst of deadly grace. Finn didn't move, just watched from the shadows, his arms folded and his back against a pillar. He said nothing. Most men, in his experience, would have rushed forward to ask questions or offer some empty praise, hoping to impress her. But Finn remained silent, simply observing her as the world seemed to slow around them. When she finished, breathless but composed, Lyra didn't acknowledge him immediately. Instead, she walked past him, casually resting her blade on her shoulder. You don't speak, she remarked, glancing at him. Most men don't wait for permission. A faint smile tugged at Finn's lips. Most men aren't trying to make it through the day. Her sharp gaze lingered on him. Would you spar with me? Finn hesitated, sizing her up. I don't think I'd win. But would you run? No. With a flick of her wrist, Lyra tossed him a practice blade. He caught it easily, his fingers wrapping around the hilt in an instant. The duel was short, brutal, and fast. Finn's reflexes were quick, his movements sharp and instinctive, but she was like lightning, and lightning couldn't be blocked. She disarmed him with ease, her blade a blur in the air. He collapsed onto the stone floor, panting, looking up at her as she towered over him, her weapon aimed downward. You're smiling, she said, her voice low and keen. You fight like someone who's been waiting for a real challenge, Finn replied, his grin never fading. And you fight like someone who doesn't mind losing. He met her gaze, unblinking. I've found that sometimes losing shows you what's really worth fighting for. Lyra stared at him. Then, for the first time since she had assumed her place as queen, she laughed. It wasn't mocking nor cruel. It was the sound of the storm rolling over distant mountains, clear and surprisingly warm. And in that moment, the wind around her seemed to calm, as if even the storm had found something to listen to. The whispers in the court grew louder in the days that followed. The nobles, delicate and sharp-tongued, with a first astir, their voices always low but cutting as they gathered in velvet-draped corners. They whispered behind gilded masks, their words like obsidian blades. They didn't need to speak his name. Everyone knew who they were talking about, the human who walked beside Lyra, the one who didn't flinch when the storm in her eyes turned deadly, the Terran who had no title, no house, no claim to any throne, just a soldier, scars on his skin, and a stare that never broke when Lyra's eyes became storms themselves. They called him an anomaly, a disruption. They claimed he was a threat to the carefully crafted order they built around her isolation. But Lyra heard it all. She heard every word, every rumor that twisted through her citadel like smoke. Yet, despite their protests, she allowed Finn to walk beside her. She invited him to the War Council, where she could hear the generals argue over the logistics of their borders and the flow of resources. Finn stood behind her, his presence quiet and still, a stark contrast to the shouting voices around the table. When he spoke, it was brief and tactical, with no ego, no attempts at domination. He simply offered insight, simple, clear, and useful. He corrected a misinterpretation of Terran fleet maneuvers, preventing an ambush that would have wiped out half a sector of patrols. The generals were reluctant at first, skeptical, but soon their skepticism gave way to quiet respect. Still, the murmurs in the court did not quiet. They said she was softening, weakening, but they were wrong. Lyra was becoming something far more dangerous. One evening, Lyra stood alone in her chamber, gazing out across the storm-wrapped cliffs, her eyes reflecting the bright lightning that cracked across the sky. The winds howled, but her thoughts were clear, focused. Finn stood beside her, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You know they don't like me staying close, he said, his voice low. Lyra turned to him, her gaze unflinching. They want me alone, easier to worship from a distance. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, then asked, And what do you want? Without hesitation, Finn answered, To stand beside you, not behind you. It wasn't the kind of answer that should have mattered, but it did. For a moment, Lyra took a small step closer, her eyes searching his face. What if I offered you power? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. I didn't come for power, Finn replied, his tone steady and sure. Then why did you stay? Because you never asked me to be afraid. Outside, the thunder cracked the night wide open. But within her, something gentler took root. For the first time, Lyra wondered what it might feel like to be seen, not as a queen, a weapon, or a legend, but as a woman with a name, a woman with a heart that had been silenced by fear for so long. The attack came at dawn. A faction of the outer houses, emboldened by the rumors of her weakness, launched a surprise strike against the citadel's southern gates. They came with cloaked vessels and weapons laced with anti-energy fields, ancient relics designed to disrupt her ability to command the storms. Their goal was clear: to depose her, to claim she had been compromised, softened by the Terran influence. The skies above the cliffs thundered as 1,000 warriors surged forward, their weapons flashing in the dawn light. Explosions shook the obsidian towers, and sirens wailed through the citadel. But Lyra was already there, her power surging as she met the invaders head-on. Finn was at her side, his sword drawn, his pulse steady, prepared for the onslaught. The moment they stepped onto the battlefield, lightning cracked through the clouds in response, her power flaring like a second sun. But the invaders had come prepared. Their field emitters hummed and sparked, creating a dome that dulled the electric threads that danced across her skin. For a moment, her power stuttered, but it didn't falter for long. Finn was the first to strike, moving with brutal efficiency, a flurry of steel and instinct. He wasn't like her guards, graceful, precise, elegant. He fought with raw force, driven by something deep, something personal. He fought like someone who had nothing left to prove and everything to protect. Lyra watched as he carved a path through the chaos, buying her the time she needed to focus. She gathered the remnants of her strength, drawing the storm inside her, not through the air, but through herself. She leapt into fray, her fists crackling with thunder, her blade cutting through field armor as if it were paper. Together, they moved in sync, a dance of fury and fire, war written into their every move. By sunrise, the rebellion had collapsed. The surviving traitors were dragged before the throne, their armor scorched, their bodies bruised and broken. The court watched in breathless silence as Lyra stood over them, not with rage, but with clarity. "You do not fear me," she said, her voice cold and steady. "You fear what I might become if I stopped being alone." Finn stepped beside her, his presence a silent testament to his strength. She didn't wave him away. Instead, she allowed the court to see him for what he truly was. Her sword, her protector, her stormbreaker. Later, alone in her chambers, Lyra sat by the window, her arms marked with bruises, her breath slow and labored. Finn entered without knocking, blood smeared across his cheek, dust in his hair. "You saved me," she said quietly. He knelt before her, wiping the blood from his face. "You didn't need saving." "No," she whispered, "but I needed someone who wouldn't fear standing with me." For the first time in her life, Lyra leaned forward, not as a queen, not as a warrior, but as a woman whose heart had never been touched without trembling. She kissed him, and outside, the storm finally quieted. But within her, the storm never stopped. She appreciated the way he didn't push for her attention when she was lost in her thoughts or in need of comfort. He simply stood beside her, silent and steady, allowing her to make the first move, to decide when to lean on him. It was something she hadn't realized she needed until he came into her life. On the third night following the rebellion, she led him to a place few dared to visit, the ruins of the ancient Temple of Ether, a sacred ground where the first rulers of her world, the Verons, once pledged themselves to the storm. The wind here was older than time itself, the stone carved with markings even she couldn't decipher. They walked in silence, and when they reached the monument, the air itself seemed to pulse. It wasn't magic. It was history, the weight of ages pressing down on them. "This is where I became queen," she said quietly, her voice breaking the stillness. She didn't claim the throne by inheritance or ceremony. No, she had stood before this very monument, where the storm had tested her and she had passed. Finn's fingers grazed the ancient stone, trailing over its surface. "How did you endure?" he asked softly. Lyra glanced at him, her eyes momentarily cold as she spoke. "I didn't feel anything. I was still cold, unshaken. That's what they wanted. That's how I survived." Finn's gaze met hers. "And now," she hesitated, her voice softening. "Now I want to feel." She paused and added, barely above a whisper, "And I'm terrified of what that makes me." Finn stepped forward, lifted his hand to gently rest against her cheek. "It makes you alive," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. She didn't pull away. The wind around them shifted, not in fury, but as if sighing with them. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, for the first time since she took the throne, allowing herself to feel something without fear. The announcement was subtle. There was no grand proclamation, no ceremony, just an understated gesture. Finn stood beside her, not behind her, during the annual festival of renewal. The people noticed. His presence spoke volumes. No longer was he merely a guest, a curiosity. He was hers. And without needing to say it aloud, she made it clear that he was as much a part of her world as she was of his. There were no formal words to describe what they had. Veyron's language had many ways to define power, lineage, and dominion, but few ways to describe love. That word was reserved for ancient songs, carried on the winds, whispered to the stars. But the people saw it in how she looked at him when he wasn't speaking, in how his hand hovered near hers, not out of possessiveness, but with an understanding that she could reach for him any time, and that he would never pull away. The court shifted. The nobles whispered, but the rebellion had burned away their boldness. None dared challenge the bond they witnessed growing, day by day. One night, in the garden of molten flowers, Lyra walked barefoot across the warm, glassy ground, her long cloak trailing behind her. Finn followed, observing the way the night wrapped around her like a secret only the stars could understand. "Do you ever miss your world?" she asked, her voice soft, not turning to him. "Sometimes," Finn replied honestly, "but not enough to leave." She looked over her shoulder at him. "And if Earth called you home?" "I've already found it," he said, his voice steady. The glow of the flowers lit her face, casting her in soft hues. She stopped just a breath away from him, looking up into his eyes. "I've ruled without equal," she began, her voice quiet but filled with something heavier than command. "I've killed without regret. I've carried nations on my shoulders and crushed uprisings with my hands. But I've never let someone in, not like this." "Then let me stay," Finn said, his voice gentle but firm. "Not to take anything, just to be the one who doesn't leave." She placed his hand over her heart, her touch as soft as the whisper of a storm. "You were never afraid," she murmured. "No," he answered, "but I never expected to care this much." Their foreheads touched, and in that moment, Lyra understood that storms could do more than destroy. They could cleanse. They could also create. And in the space between the wind and the warmth, between power and presence, she let herself fall, not from grace, not from strength, but into something far older, far deeper. She let herself fall in love. The war came at dawn, but not from rebels within her realm. It came from beyond Veyron's stars, an old alliance, once loyal, now turned cold after she refused to bow to their demands. This time, they didn't come with gifts, but with warships and dreadnoughts, accusing her of weakness, emotional unpredictability, blaming her bond with Finn. Lyra stood atop the citadel, cloaked in the steel of her armor, her blade resting on her shoulder, lightning coiling in the sky like a crown. Finn stood beside her as ever, calm and quiet, watching the enemy's descent turn the sky blood red. "You don't have to fight this time," Finn said softly. "I do," Lyra replied, her voice steady. "But not for my throne. For them. And for you." Finn nodded. "Then I'll be beside you." "No," she said, turning to face him fully. "This time, I need you to live, not as my blade, but as my future." She kissed him slowly, tasting the storm she had once wielded as armor, then turned away, stepping off the balcony and summoning the wind. The battle that followed was unlike any her people had seen in generations. Lyra met the enemy in the air, moving like fire and thunder. Her war cry bent the clouds, and energy shields cracked under the onslaught. The city's defenses roared to life. But the invaders had come prepared, bringing planetary disruptors and gravity spikes. Silent weapons forged far from the watchful eyes of her spies. At the third hour, a beam of collapsed matter struck the western spire. The explosion swallowed half the citadel wall. Finn ran into the fire, heedless of the danger. The guards tried to stop him, but he charged through the falling debris, shouting her name, fighting through smoke and flame until he reached the broken edge of the tower. There, beneath a mountain of stone and steel, Lyra lay, scorched and breathless. For the first time, Finn saw her bleed, and it shattered him. He dropped to his knees beside her, cradling her head in his hands, his fingers trembling. "You're going to be fine," he whispered, even as blood stained his palms. "I've got you. You're okay." Her eyes opened just enough to meet his. "You're crying," she said, her voice barely audible. "Of course I am. You weren't supposed to cry. You weren't supposed to fall." She smiled faintly, then stopped, as if breaking the rules of fate itself. The storm above them pulsed again, brighter than ever, and in that moment, her people saw something impossible. The queen bled, but still, her storm burned in the sky. It took 3 days to drive the invaders from orbit, 3 days of relentless counterattacks. Storm-born warriors fighting with fury unlike anything before. Their queen had fallen, but she had not died, and that changed everything. Lyra survived, broken but alive. Finn never left her side, not during the surgeries, not during the healing rituals, not even when the feverish storm tried to claim her mind. He sat beside her as the rain whispered through open windows. When she raged, he held her hand. When she wept, he let her. When she slept, he watched the rise and fall of her chest, a rhythm steadier than thunder. On the 10th morning, she opened her eyes. "You stayed?" she whispered. "I wasn't going anywhere." She looked at him, seeing the bandages and scars for the first time. "I look different," she murmured. "You look like yourself," he replied, his voice steady. Finally, she reached for him, not with power, not with command, but with need, honest and raw. Finn took her hand, and together they walked slowly onto the balcony, where thousands had gathered, uncertain if she would return. When they saw her, leaning on a man with no crown, no title, only love in his eyes, the silence broke, not into applause, but into song. The Oldham of Eron, once sung only for rulers who had died in glory, was now offered to a queen who had survived, with her heart intact. Lyra stood before them, scarred but sovereign, and with a gesture, she raised Finn's hand, saying, without thunder, without command, "This is not my shadow. This is my equal." And for the first time, the people did not bow in fear. They bowed in love. The wind above the citadel shifted, gentle now. A sky once ruled by storms welcomed light through its clouds. And Seraphine, the queen who was once untouchable, let herself be touched not by fear, but by the man who never needed to conquer her to win her. And the world, in its quiet way, changed.